Hey everyone, welcome back to the Questioning Behaviour podcast. As always, it's me, Merle, here with my much better half, Sarah Bowen.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science.
And of course, as always, we're joined by an even more amazing guest, and today it is Sam Tatum. Please, Sam, introduce yourself to the crowd. Who are you? What do you do? And how did you get there?
Thanks so much, Mel and Sarah. It's really lovely to join you on the podcast. So my name's Sam Tatum. I'm the global lead of behavioural science at Ogilvy. So Ogilvy is a big creative network, traditionally known as an advertising agency, but we have a large innovation and consulting arm that our behavioural science practice falls within. How did I get there? So I come from an organisational psychology background. So I'm an organizational psych in my training. So I've always been interested in normative behavior. So oftentimes if you go down the route of psychology, there's a sort of a fork in the road between abnormality and where we look at sort of depression and anxiety and clinical scenarios and more sort of normative settings. So I sort of went through the organizational route that's opened up a lot of paths for me, and that led me to Ogilvy.
Oh, fantastic.
It was lovely. It's what it was. By the time so I started at Ogilvy in a role called a planner, and it's got nothing to. It's actually, it's one of those odd titles. It's not got anything really to do with planning, but it's more sort of a strategist role, and it's one of these jobs that everyone who lands themselves as a planner in an agency, certainly people I've spoken to, it's sort of, if I knew this job existed the whole time, I wouldn't have wasted all the time going around the houses and doing all these other roles. So I started as a strategist in Ogilvy in Australia, and then sort of more formally brought my background of psychology into the business and moved over to the UK about 6 years ago, and been leading the practice in the UK, and more recently the global behavioural science practice at Ogilvy. So that's how I sort of came to be in that business.
Fantastic.
All right.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking to us today and taking time out of, I guess, what sounds like an incredibly busy job, leading behavioural practice. So could you tell us a little bit more about what you do as a practitioner, consultant? I don't know how you would formally describe yourself, but what kind of work do you actually do on a day-to-day basis?
Great question, and probably both. Technically, we are consultants and practitioners of applied behavioural science, and one of the lovely parts of our job is the weird and wonderful sorts of questions and challenges that people tend to pose to us. So that can be working in countries like Nigeria or Pakistan or all across the world, in Indonesia, to work with sort of lower income consumers to help increase the consumption of fortified products, and how we better understand human behavior to sort of nudge people towards more sort of healthy sort of diets and help to increase the efficacy of fortified products that don't do anything unless you have a significant consumption frequency, all the way through to working in Palo Alto, helping brands like Facebook launch hardware products, to everything in between. So it's a really sort of a smorgasbord of interesting challenges that we get to sink our teeth into, and really what we do, and it's not rocket science in the sense of the process that many would be familiar with in understanding the nature of the problem, making sure we're asking the right questions. We tend to be brought in when there's a behavior that needs changing or a perception that needs informing, then ultimately will lead to a behavior down the line. Really just about bringing the right sort of tools and the right questions to make sure we're getting to the crux of the challenge and understanding the nuance of what might be causing that or preventing that action from occurring. And by doing that sort of translation, we're able to then bring what might be considered a slightly different toolkit to helping to build that up. So again, if we ask a sort of the right question of the challenge, then we might offer ourselves up some less obvious solutions to help us bring that to bear. Right. But the critical thing for us then is what we do with it. We're still very much fundamentally we're a creative business. We pride ourselves on extending the category, on finding new ways in which the science can be deployed in unexpected ways, and it's wonderful to spend my time in a place that values those things. Science and creativity coming together. It's a wonderful space to be.
Yeah, I can absolutely imagine. So on that topic, if you're allowed or able to talk about this, what was the most creative way that you feel that you have applied behavioral science? What was a project that when you look back in hindsight, you were like, yeah, that is some really new, innovative, and very creative way of applying the behavioral science that before this project, I wouldn't have necessarily considered?
One that comes to mind, and oftentimes we find it sort of obvious in retrospect, right? And that's with every creative idea. They say always seems so obvious, but you probably wouldn't have got there immediately. And the ideas that I'm most proud of being associated with are the ones that we wouldn't have got to through traditional means. So growing up, for lack of a better term, through Ogilvy as a strategist, I've been involved in wonderful creative ideas that didn't necessarily come from the behavioral sciences. they're just wonderful. So we don't sort of monopolize creativity. It's just a way in which you can exhaust other ways of finding a solution. So one idea I think that may not have come through a sort of a more traditional means, or certainly would have been harder to sell in through traditional means, working in factory safety. So again, a space that you probably wouldn't expect a business like Ogilvy to be working in big factories in North America. And we spent a lot of time in different factories for a client. Fascinating in these contexts, you find that people are working really long shifts over long time periods. So they're working sort of 12-hour days. Over every time we went to a factory, someone was getting their 30-year anniversary, right? So, and what we know is that the more familiar you become with the context, the more risks that you tend to take. So I think that the statistic is that a third of car accidents occur a mile from your home. You're sort of more likely to sort of switch off, and we can all sort of experience that. But that's quite dangerous when you're in a scenario that's equally, if not more dangerous than driving a vehicle in a factory. What we tend to do in those circumstances is then protect people from hurting themselves. So we'll give people steel cap boots, and we'll give them gloves and helmets and eyeglasses, and so we'll sort of prevent these injuries from occurring. But something interesting happens when we do that too. So actually, by protecting people physically, we can activate a bit of a compensation. You almost feel more comfortable putting yourself at risk if you feel more protected. Yeah. So we found actually in the Rio Olympics, they were the first Olympics to ever ban men from wearing the headgear in boxing. They found actually men are more likely to wear to get a concussion if they're wearing protective equipment, because they just put their head in more stupid places, right? Because they think that they're safe. So the killer question from that was, how do we actually make people feel at greater risk? So speaking with the head of occupational health and safety and saying what we need to do is make our workers feel a little bit more vulnerable to be a solution to help people act a little bit safer. So the simple solution we did was just looking at gloves and boots and hats. We called it vulnerable personal protective equipment. And we trialed different gloves, so just with skeletons basically on the back of gloves, just to have a subtle reminder that you are vulnerable. Created a really clever, I think it was clever, gentleman on the team whipped it up, survey to help us assess this. The good thing in factory safety is you don't have a high base rate. So it's very hard to get significance or measures because fortunately this isn't happening all the time. So we tested sort of different injury scenarios with people with bare hands, people with normal gloves, or people with our skeleton gloves. And we found a positive correlation between vulnerability and risk taking. So the more vulnerable people felt, the fewer risks that they were happy to take. We had a really interesting measure on different styles of injury. So if people were being injured by a drop saw, it didn't really matter if you're wearing gloves or vulnerable. I mean, you're going to hurt, if it's a drop saw, you're going to hurt yourself. But when you go to a sort of a lesser significant injury like a box cutter or a Stanley knife, we had a really strong association between our gloves and risk taking. So it's just a lovely way of sort of stepping someone through what might be a counterintuitive solution to say what we need to do is not make people feel safe, but feel a little bit at risk. And actually you can achieve that with 10 cents worth of paint on every glove that we mass produce. So that's a sort of a lovely, sort of obvious but small idea that sort of comes to mind.
For some reason, I imagine everyone is dressed like skeletons in this factory. It's like Halloween every day. Yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, I always, I guess, had the had the story of like American football players versus rugby players in my mind in terms of very sort of similar sports and you're sort of tackling each other. But when you've got that gear on, you know, in American football, like the amount of force that you sort of collide into each other is much greater. Yeah. So it's a really, really cool example. I mean, it almost, this could, you know, go off into a completely different direction of conversation, but it brings to mind all these things about ethical considerations about, you know, what are the ethical considerations of making someone feel vulnerable if it's to take an action that is going to increase their safety? I mean, it reminds me very much of the pandemic, trying to get people to obey social distancing rules and wearing masks and stuff and all the messaging from the government.
A fascinating question. I think there it's not changing the safety. So we're adding a psychological layer to an existing technical solution. So what we're doing is removing what might be an unintended consequence of a tangible safety solution. So that's where I think the role of psychology can play, not necessarily replacing hard defaults and processes in safety, but we're at a level where actually it's not about some of those mechanical solutions. It's about increasing the use of a mechanical solution, or it's about increasing the perceived value of the mechanical solution that's in place, rather than actually taking away anything that we've already developed over time.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I imagine a lot of your time is spent creating these stories as well. It's such a cool story of these sort of twisting something that you would have thought is so obvious, that obviously wearing protective gear makes you safer. But, you know, having that sort of psychological angle of, well, actually, it's really quite captivating.
That's a big part of the selling journey, I suppose. The same thing holds true in advertising, right? You can spend half an hour and the conclusion is 3 words, right? Like you just sort of need to walk someone to why they need to invest $1 million behind 3 words. And we've sort of found over time that it often helps in our discipline to sort of speak to the literature. Like this is what the academia says, but then sort of speak to a more sort of anecdotal, personally relevant example. You know, and so you can sort of talk about the literature behind the diversification heuristic, and you can talk about college, university students buying different snacks at different cereal events, and you can sort of justify that the diversification heuristic exists. And for those at home, it sort of is essentially that we tend to diversify sort of longer term decisions, and we tend to sort of be consistent with shorter term, more immediate decisions. And people can nod and agree with the literature, but if you then say, like, when you go on holiday, do you pack 3 pairs of jeans that you never wear, and you load your iPod up with music albums that you don't listen to, and people sort of nod along. So if you can sort of get them with, like, this is what the literature says, and you can see it within yourself, then maybe you can believe that it works for you, sort of this challenging your brand.
Yeah, I have a specific question though. So you already mentioned, and I think most people know, Ogilvy is traditionally an advertising firm. So, and obviously, you know, Rory has come through, for the listener who doesn't know, although very unlikely, Rory Sutherland has, of course, been a foundational force in creating the behavioral unit at Ogilvy. But how does the behavioral unit at Ogilvy then come on to taking on the cases that you've just described? So the safety project for factories in Northern America is not something that I seamlessly associate with the behavioral unit of an advertising firm. So are these 2 units less tight than I imagined them to be? Or do you have completely different mission and visions? Like, how does this work? How does this integrate?
Good question. So we have the same mission and vision in this. First and foremost, we're a creative business, and advertising is a means to achieve an objective, and creative advertising is more effective than less creative advertising. So I think insofar as a business, we're completely aligned. But you mentioned Rory, and one of the sort of an old adage of Rory that's sort of initially sparked some of the drive for the behavioral science practice was that at Ogilvy, I mean, it's amazing people that we sort of, Rory would say, have the ability of being a general hospital, but we tend to focus as cosmetic surgeons. I mean, like so actually, what we need to do is, and the growth and innovation consulting business is really taking that now. That actually answering questions that sort of a traditional agency might not normally be asked. This is a general hospital. So being able to receive a brief on factory safety or on recycling in communities or on whatever it might be. I mean, weird and wonderful, helping someone sell off the world's most expensive postage stamp and fractions. It doesn't we just get the most wonderful questions. But as a general hospital, you can begin to answer those and then pull in the specialist teams when that time arises, so we can then draw on colleagues within our social practice or within PR or within our health business or within our broader advertising if need be. And similarly, we work with the advertising business depending on the nature of the challenge that they feel that this could be a real unlocker. So oftentimes we do play the role of strategist within a broader communications brief. And it just helps us to sort of agitate new soil than we would have maybe covered if we weren't in the room.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And I guess part of this, if I can take your general hospital metaphor and run with it, part of being the doctors on the floor with all your problems is about diagnosing what the actual problem is. How much of your time do you think you actually end up spending trying to actually pinpoint and figure out what the problem is that you could potentially solve within the brief?
Yeah, I mean, a lot. What's the old sort of measure twice, cut once? So a lot of time and bringing the right research methodologies to best understand the nature of the challenge, and that can be looking at environmental audits, or it could be looking at other cognitive factors of an audience group, whether that's looking at personality factors, worldview, other sort of cognitive traits that might be conducive for preventing a desired action. So a lot of time in exploration to find that, okay, this is sort of the real why. Chris Graves, our colleague in the US, sort of this lovely term, finding the real why, and then we can sort of start to surround it with hypotheses of the best solutions. And that's another important point, that we exit with evidence-based hypotheses that we aim to prove or disprove and continue or discontinue.
And what for you is the main reason to discontinue?
If something's not working.
Yeah.
So and there are many instances. I say many, and I can't think, but there are certainly cases of well-intended solutions that we find don't work within a context. That's another part of the sphere of behavioral science, that we know how important context is, and just the execution of a specific element of psychology. It's not always a silver bullet, but it helps us to focus where we explore. We'll sort of focus and expand, right? You can sort of focus on, well, here's a suite of, like, let's start here first, but it also opens up, I bet we probably didn't consider making it harder, making it more expensive, making people feel more vulnerable rather than safer, right? That opens up the space for solutions rather than closes it down.
Now, of course, if I have asked you about your most creative project, now, of course, as we're going on to the slight tangent of things that didn't work, which one surprised you most that it didn't work, or that maybe even backfired, where you were genuinely, given the literature, given what we know so far, what we've done before, this ought to work, and unfortunately, nothing.
So a couple of these might not be the best, and again, it's sort of in retrospect, it makes sense. Some of these didn't work, but the sort of logic at the time, sort of it's worth exploring. A few years ago, we did a big project for Christian Aid in London or the UK, looking at their donation campaign. So they have a Christian Aid Awareness Week where they sort of send letters, and it was a lovely brief. I remember what it came through, and essentially the task was to optimize an envelope. It's really great focused brief, and we trialed lots of different things, like changing the orientation, changing the stock of the paper, make it heavier. The team will know I always sort of tend to gravitate to ideas or solutions that involve the scent of smell. So I wanted to sort of fumigate these envelopes with like grandma's perfume to remind people of getting money in their birthday. That didn't get up. But what we did find was sort of just changing the orientation, which increased the sort of the affordance of putting money in from the top. For some reason, the images were designed in a different way. So increasing the affordance and actually increasing the stock of the paper to make them feel a bit heavier had really significant impacts. But a well-intended solution was just reminding people of what's called gift aid in the UK. So it's essentially sort of the tax rebate of donations, and just reminding people of the basically free money for donations if you're able to do this. And that backfired significantly. We would have lost a lot if that was our only solution. And logically, rationally, it makes sense that we would remind people of this. But it had the adverse effect. And as behavioral scientists or as psychologists, we look at this. And again, sometimes what was a well-intended solution, there's a lot of literature around crowding out effects of pro-social behavior. And so what you don't want to do is mix up the motivation. So if someone's donating because of this warm glow that they might feel of doing something positive for society, don't confuse that with a financial incentive. I'm not doing that for thriftiness or profitability. I'm doing it for a totally different motivator. So you're sort of mixing the motivational force. So that was one that backfired, that sort of makes sense in retrospect, but it was well intended at the time. Then there are always solutions that, as I said, part of what we pride ourselves in is pushing the envelope a bit to find, sort of extend how this can work. And we've recently done some waste management trials in London, looking at how we can prevent people from stacking bags around public bins and see how we can sort of help people to get them in and fold up their waste and just sort of clean up the streets. And there was one solution that I was sort of, just because I felt there was a real opportunity to scale it quite simply, is looking at biophilia solutions. So making it feel like it's a clean environment, making it feel like the sort of place that you wouldn't waste. And even more so, actually putting around the bins little decals of a flower bed. So to make it feel people feel a bit odd, or like we were sort of wanted to have birds' nests. Like if you put a bag of rubbish on a bird's nest, like you're a psychopath. So you really want to sort of trial these. And what I like about that is to see sort of what starts as quite high definition. This is a flower bed or a bird's nest. Over time, you might find this could just be a really subtle visual cue that just makes it feel like an exclusion zone for waste that you don't want to put there. So I was sort of gunning on that one, just because I thought there was a high degree of novelty and there was the ability to scale, but that went backwards, unfortunately.
Oh.
I think it went backwards. It certainly wasn't the highest performer. There are always things that you either want to work or have strong evidence to suspect why it would work, either scientifically or just creatively. You're for it, but we need to look at the data and make sort of the next round decisions based on that.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess that's just why we need to trial things and test things and continue to, approach it with some sort of scientific, or at least some sort of exploratory mindset, at least. But I mean, I'm curious, because there must be cases, and I think even your example of the factory floor and trying to increase safety, there must be cases you come across where it's incredibly hard to either observe the behavior, or there's just not enough incidences of certain events happening for you to reach that statistical threshold to be able to say something confidently. Yep. So what do you do in that case? Like, do you have sort of a rule of thumb of what's sort of the bar of evidence that you will accept as an indicator whether or not something is going in the right or wrong direction?
Really good question. And I suppose it depends on the nature of the challenge. So in a safety environment, if we're looking at rubber stamping a solution or building an argument for further investment, it's important that it's as robust as it can be. And as you say, in a factory scenario, the base rate is low, so we need to be creative with how we build the evidence case for that. And that's where we looked at sort of an interesting survey solution with videos and split tests. And so that was sort of how we circumnavigated that. In other scenarios, we might find that we don't always get to what would be a sort of a classic 95% confidence interval, but we're talking about a suite of solutions that some are still more stronger than others, right? So if many clients wouldn't necessarily go through the scientific process by which they sort of escalate ideas, and at least we're getting a step closer to that. And in many challenges we face, we're always seeking what would be a sort of a medical classic peer-reviewed figure, but we're able to at least provide a steer as to, from the journey that we've been on and what we've found, the evidence is suggesting that this is the right approach. And when you're looking at either marketing challenges or issues that aren't necessarily life or death as they are in factory safety, then you can afford to have a bit more wiggle room and be sort of pragmatic in the solution. Otherwise, you can find we don't progress if we don't start to, because by taking the next step, we learn more.
Mm-hmm. So it's a really difficult one to answer, because I guess it just depends on the situation as well. Yeah.
I think it does. I think it depends on the situation, the risk, the expectations of a business, but the most important thing from our perspective is that we just present the results and counsel what we would do, or what are the implications of progressing, or things that we can discount. Sometimes it's just as valuable to say, look, we had high hopes. We had high hopes on these birds' nests, but I can't even wrangle that one back. Let's progress with the other solutions. So that helps in discounting as well as progressing, because as I said, you learn as much the next step, and it doesn't mean it's always sort of copy paste, right? You always learn. So you optimize, and it's just at sort of what level you're comfortable, or do we go back to the drawing board? But it's not often the case that we just start again.
Okay. So we've gone through some amazing examples of projects and briefs that you've worked on and lessons learned from those. Are those in the book? Surprise everyone, Sam wrote a book.
They're not actually. I don't in the book don't go into these sort of explicit cases, but a sort of a central philosophy that we've talked about is certainly part of my belief. Is what driven me for many years and has, I think, shaped some of our approach at Ogilvy, and so certainly sort of a philosophy that I embrace, but not necessarily in explicitly in these cases.
So what is in the book then?
So the book's called Evolutionary Ideas. So the central premise of the book is that ideas and solutions evolve in nature, just like biological solutions evolve. So beaks and wings and dorsal fins are all biological solutions that have been shaped by context. And what's really interesting when you look in evolution is that you can find that entirely different species can evolve on the same biological solution. So a shark and a dolphin both have a dorsal fin, even though the shark is a fish and the dolphin is a mammal. The shark breathes in gills and the dolphins need to surface for air. So entirely different species can converge on the same solution. So a central premise is that is occurring all around us through ideas and particularly through sort of my lens, psychological solutions. So Sarah, you mentioned before when we were talking about vulnerability, and I mentioned boxers in Rio, you brought up NFL players and rugby players, right? So there's two different sports, same behavior. And just as we might act in ways, or our sort of evolved processes and perceptions and responses to sort of respond in a scenario, we've also evolved to generate sort of shared solutions. And so this is an exploration as to understanding that it occurs, that there are these patterns of ideas that are all around us. But more importantly, once you sort of know and are able to spot the pattern, then we're able to deploy them in foreign contexts.
I see.
So if you can put a dorsal fin on a sheep if it's got the same challenge, right? And in the book I explore and I sort of stumbled across this a few years ago, and that was the trigger for the book, really. Because and the field is biomimicry, and you might be familiar with biomimicry, and but for people who aren't, essentially the field of biomimicry believes that anything that's around us in nature has essentially survived sort of 3.8 billions of years of research and development. There's got to be something good about it, because it's sort of it's survived natural processes. So what biomimicry does is tend to find solutions that are evolved in nature and deploy them to solve sort of distinctively human challenges. So the kingfisher beak, the shape of the kingfisher beak to sort of plunge from the air into water, sort of a beautifully aerodynamic shape, was sort of borrowed from really heavily to design the nose of the Japanese bullet train, the Shinkansen 500. So there are lots of examples of biomimicry where we sort of learn about air conditioning systems based on the blood flow of jackrabbit ears, or there's this wonderful business in the US that's designing wind turbines based on humpback whale fins.
Yeah.
That enables them to sort of increase the lift and reduce the drag. So you can really sort of steal from nature, because you can identify that there's a biological solution. And the same thing, and this is really sort of the big piece of evolutionary ideas, is that we can do that with psychological solutions. So we can see that actually, if there's a risk compensation mechanism that's occurring in factory safety, I wonder what's occurring with health insurance or superannuation or pension. That people feel like they're locked and loaded, so they overspend, right? I don't know, Merle, you'll be able to tell us more than I will, but you might find parallel universes where this compensatory behavior occurs, right? Where we actually we overspend just as we put ourselves at more risk. So how can we learn from the Rio boxers or NFL players to make people feel more vulnerable than they might with their finances? And so you can sort of translate that idea just as you shifted a beak to a train.
Yeah, really cool. So it's kind of about transferability of solutions across domains, right?
No, that's entirely it. And so there's a few sort of building blocks of the narrative. And the first is looking at biology and evolved biology and biomimicry. And then there's another exploration of sort of evolved technical solutions, because the same thing occurs in technology. And instead of millions of years, you're talking about thousands of engineers and designers that tend to converge on the same solutions. And there's an existing tool called TRIZ. It's a Russian acronym for Theory of Inventive Problem Solving. But essentially, they've found, I think, about 39 different sort of patterns, or what they call inventive principles. So 39 different sort of inventive principles of technical solutions that you can tend to sort of say, well, that's an example of number 7, the nested doll.
Right.
So the old classic Russian nested doll. If you think of a telescopic lens, if you think of a nail polish brush that goes inside the bottle, or a retractable tape measure, those are all examples of the nested doll. So we can sort of see this in technical solutions, but we're sort of very close to it in psychological solutions. And hopefully what I've done is take us to the next step. And we will be familiar with sort of psychological principles or biases or heuristics that sometimes can be helpful. Sometimes they can be harmful if you sort of over rely on them. But what they do give us is a language to navigate, right? Once you can say risk compensation or mechanism, you can sort of bring that vocabulary, then you can say, well, actually, I can see this here, 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 here. So there's a whole chapter in the book actually that explores about language and how language is such an unlocker. If you have a word for something, then you see it more often. And there's lots of fascinating research in color, and you may be familiar with sort of Greek and Russian words for light blue and dark blue, which are categorically different. In English, we just see this as sort of as categorically blue. You put someone who's Greek or Russian in a brain scanner, and they'll see that actually something different is happening here. It's not the spectrum, it's two categorical differences. So having a language for these concepts that we've sort of the world of academia and government around behavioral science has sort of armed us with this language, then we can see it, right? And you see it everywhere. Once you sort of can start to see these patterns of solutions, you find actually, whether it's a baker or a banker or riding the local bus, you'll see these shared solutions that are addressing shared challenges. In TRIZ, one of the most fascinating things that they do, it's an innovation model, right? So it's around how can we use these patterns to innovate more efficiently. And what they've developed in TRIZ is a matrix. So this gentleman who identified these patterns, or there's what is also sort of a lack of novel innovation. They essentially identified that 95% of patents have already been solved just in another category. So there's only sort of 1% moonshot novel innovation. But he defined, his name was Genrich Altschul, sort of defined innovation as solving a contradiction. So in technology or in mechanical or engineering solutions, it might be, how do I make an umbrella big enough to cover the human body, but small enough to fit in the handbag, right? So that's sort of contradiction, big but small. And so that requires innovation. And maybe we can look at the inventive principles to say, well, how do we do that? How do we make a bulletproof jacket strong enough to stop a bullet, but light enough that someone can wear it, right? That requires innovation. And so they've developed a sort of a contradiction matrix where you can look at sort of the more measurable elements of speed and weight and volume, and you can sort of see, how can I increase the speed of this without increasing the weight of that? And it sort of focuses in on, well, here are the 5 inventive principles that you should start with. And so I sort of explore a similar dynamic and looking at psychological contradictions that we tend to face most frequently. So in the book, I explore sort of 5 really sort of common, significant, sticky challenges that tend to be consistent that we face with. So the first is about increasing trust without changing the truth. So that's a psychological contradiction. How do I trigger action without forcing a response? That's a psychological contradiction. How do I boost loyalty without increasing compensation? How do I sort of improve experiences without changing the duration? How do I aid decisions without limiting choice? So these sort of classic psychological contradictions that, as we mentioned before, Sarah, that it's not necessarily about changing the mechanics of the technology all the time. It's about adding a psychological layer to address this space that remains.
Fascinating.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to reading that book for sure. When is it coming out?
So it's coming out in May, so 10th of May in 2022.
Very exciting.
It's very exciting. I can put it on my my 3 months from now to-do list to make sure that I remember purchasing it, because I don't have that type of memory span. But
No.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you're obviously bursting with sort of knowledge about this book. And I mean, even those 5 contradictions, I think, could pose entire theses of discussion themselves. So is this book sort of a starting point for you, see, or is it, its own self-contained sort of finished thing?
I certainly see it as a starting. It's laying down the philosophy as to how we can begin to use psychology, behavioral science, evolutionary psychology, more importantly, to more systematically solve problems.
Yeah.
So I think oftentimes behavioral science can still be viewed as sort of magic or the mystical dark arts, and not actually what can be a systematic process. A large element of the book is also, I mean, because hopefully clearly, I value creativity sort of immensely. And sometimes you can think about sort of a systematic approach to innovation and creativity as being sort of polar opposite. But when you investigate it, actually most creative endeavors have or artists or musicians or playwrights or authors have a structured approach to creativity. If you can understand the structure, just as you can understand the 39 principles of Triz, or you can be armed with some of the sort of the principles of psychology, once you have this structure, you can sort of approach it more like a pilot and a checklist rather than this sort of lone genius in a garage somewhere.
Right.
And that's one of the primary sort of reasons for the book. Certainly how it opens is this infatuation that we all have with revolutionary thinking. We all sort of think that it's sort of, I've got a big problem, so I need a big solution, or a novel problem, so I need a novel solution, right? We just have and I sort of unpack why that's the case in the book. But if we can start to sort of think, actually, you'd see realistically that as much as we might hope, in sort of moonshot innovation is such a minute proportion of actually the innovation that occurs around us, and there's far more that even you would still consider as creative and step changing, but it comes from somewhere.
Right.
It's not a blank slate and a lightning bolt. It comes from carefully defined stimulus and questions to help your brain get somewhere that you wouldn't otherwise. And so this, and sorry, Sarah, you asked the question about, is it a complete package, or is it sort of the beginning? I think there's a lot in there. There's a lot I've wanted to share, and a lot I think it's a fraction of what is possible, and where we can go with it, where we do go with it. But it's starting us in this mindset. There are shared problems that we face, and if we can understand the shared patterns of solutions that we naturally converge upon, then we can collectively be more effective and efficient in coming up with solutions for those.
Wow.
Okay. High aspirations, high dreams. Is that the purpose of the book? But is that also how you would want behavioral science to develop in general? Where do you see it going exactly?
Behavioral science is a discipline?
Sure.
I think, in a couple of different ways. So I think this is one way, and there's a lot of, as with any study, there's limitations to a belief, to any approach, right? There's limitations. So the limitations with this approach is that much of the language or the principles of behavioral science have been set in different contexts and Western audiences, and the fundamental challenges of some of behavioral science that are still applied. The positive here, I think, is that we're sort of extracting their value and deploying them in new contexts to see if they work. So that's one piece. So I think there is certainly a future in a more systematic approach to identifying a psychological pattern and trying it within our context and proving it or disproving it. I think there's another world of individual differences, either by groups or cohorts or tribes outside of classic nudge theory, that we need to go deeper on and better understand and build models and shared approaches to sort of best understand that, to make sure we're not going in with sort of one eye of sort of universality. This book is very focused on universality, but with complete awareness that that's not always the case. But if we don't start with that, we're sort of, again, we're we're left with nothing. So I think a future is going to be a happy medium of two, an assumption that there are patterns. We know there are patterns, and we don't want to overstate the consistency of effects, and that's why we need to trial them in context and see if we sort of discontinue the breeding program or we can keep going and explore what might be these differences in frame, in solution that works for some people somewhere, some other time.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I, for one, am incredibly inspired by everything that you've just said. I'm very excited for the book. It sounds like it's going to be this incredible intersection of creativity, innovation, behavioral science, much like yourself, I think, Sam. And even though you've said, behavioral science isn't this magical thing that sometimes it's presented as from an external viewer, it sounds like you found a way to package creativity and bottle it in a way that it feels like a bit of a magical potion. So very excited to dive into that. And it's May it's going to come out. Is that right?
It's May, and that's very kind. No, thank you. It's May.
Okay, fantastic. We will make sure we post the link to the book below to reduce as much friction as possible, dear listener, in case you immediately need to go and read and find out more about what this is all about, because I, for one, am very curious.
Well, thank you. No, it's been a pleasure to talk sort of about the book and also more generally. It's lovely to catch up.
Yeah.
Lovely to catch up with you. Now, except for obviously linking to the book, Sam, is there anywhere else that you would really like to direct the listeners so they can keep up with what you do or what Ogilvy does, or anywhere else in the online stratosphere that you would like the listener to go?
Thank you. No, so I mean, certainly from an Ogilvy perspective, we every year we release an annual, so we call it which is itself a lovely commitment device. It forces us to do it every year. So an annual review of work that we've done in this space, and pro-social, governmental work, the sorts of projects that are most easy for us to share. And that's a bit of a warts and all of the things that work, the things that don't. So that's something to look at retrospectively, and launching again soon. Nudge Doc is another key platform, our role within behavioral science. So this coming year is our 10th Nudge Doc, so it's going to be a great event. So that's in June. So that's certainly a bit of a sort of hopefully a convening point for interested parties to come around and learn something new in Nudge Doc. And Ogilvy is available on all classic LinkedIn, Twitter channels. Myself also on Twitter. So those would be the big ticket ones coming up. Thanks.
Fantastic. Great. Lots of stuff to look forward to. An exciting year of behavioral science ahead, we hope. We will link everything that has just been said down below so you guys can find it in the description box. But that's just to say thank you so much, Sam, for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
And that was us talking to the amazing Sam Tatum. As always, thank you so much, Sam, for coming on. Really, really enjoyed talking to you. Gives us a bit more of an insight into what it is that a behavioral science consultant does. Now, Sarah, now that we know what Sam is actually up to on like a day-to-day basis and the type of projects he does,
yes,
you could hack it as a consultant?
I think so. I think it sounds like a really cool job. Especially just the variety of the types of problems that Sam was talking about as sort of very casually as it's his day job. But it sounds as though, no surprise, Ogilvy is a place that people go to from all types of industries with all sorts of types of behavioral questions. So it's always interesting to hear some cool case studies, the application of behavioral science, how to get around, those tricky constraints when it comes to actually testing and evaluating interventions.
Absolutely.
And and hearing about what goes wrong. That's sometimes my favorite topic.
It sometimes is mine as well. I think my first question is always, so in your field of study, what's the thing that backfired the most? Which right. I can imagine catches some people off guard. But we mean well. We do so with the best intentions. And then sometimes what you had absolutely no idea would work, or what you seem to think is super counterintuitive, like making people feel more vulnerable, is exactly where you need to get them to behave in a way which is in accordance with safety and compliance measures, and of course people's own safety. So sometimes behavioral science is super intuitive, and sometimes it really bloody isn't. So I'm glad we got to discuss that. Talking about intuitive and things that make sense, maybe potentially only in hindsight, how cool is this book gonna be?
Yeah, super cool. I kind of wasn't really ready for this paradigm shift in sort of thinking about behavioral science and borrowing from evolution and nature. Very cool, very cool. I mean, I was kind of the image of, that plane with a bunch of bullet holes in it, the sort of survivorship bias image that gets thrown around on Twitter a lot.
Yeah.
That was coming up in my mind as Sam was sort of talking about, nature and sort of animals and plants, it's all the result of evolution. What we have is like the final best solution. And it always makes me wonder, well, what didn't survive? Yeah, what can we learn from that? But obviously, we'll never know. Yeah. Or maybe we will know, but that's all to do with fossils and stuff. But that's where I would be looking as well. Again, I'm somehow super obsessed with things that don't work. I think that's why you learn the most. But yeah, no, super cool. And obviously Sam has been working on this for a long time. I mean, to write a book itself is a huge achievement. And yeah, it sounds like it could be influential.
Fair enough.
I think
it could be influential. Maybe the book of 2022? Can I say that? No, because we know other amazing books have also come out or are about to come out in 2022. It is difficult. There's a lot of good... I find it really funny, and I've said this before, but during these pandemics, and maybe as a result of the lockdowns, re-evaluations, or overworking and panic working, as we've also discussed on this podcast, a lot of behavioral science books or resources have come out where I'm just like, damn, I was struggling through a pandemic. You wrote a book. I'm like, okay, so clearly we have very different schedules, and maybe I should change my panic sessions into writing sessions. Maybe then we'll get somewhere. Just keeping it in mind.
I mean,
no, but it is what it is. Now, anyway, super excited for this book. I'm also curious to see what Sam's interpretation is of these evolutionary ideas and whether we are in fact left with the best product there is, because there's always been a lot of talk, and this is both from evolution and psychology, about spandrels. For people who don't know what those are things in place that have survived somehow, and it is genuinely questionable what their function is. So I'm wondering if Sam is able to identify quite a lot of those, both throughout evolution and in our behavior as it stands now. Because I feel a lot of people might argue, and of course this is in opposition to Gigerenser's view, that a lot of the biases are still a form of spandrel.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd be interested to see if that comes through as well. I think there's definitely a book idea in there, if Sam hasn't already tackled it in his own book. We'll have to wait and see and find out. I mean, depending on when you're listening to this, you might not even have to wait too much longer or at all to read the book.
We're recording this in February. I'm pretty sure this will release end of February, so you're gonna have to wait a bit longer before you can dive into the book of the amazing Sam Tatum, obviously, famous in behavioral science. So I'm so glad he had the time to sit down with us and talk about this. I'm super excited for a book. As everyone knows, I'm a massive bookworm. So yes, guys, thanks to Sam for sitting down. Thanks to you guys for listening. And we just hope that you had an entertaining episode to listen to. And hopefully it was also interesting, fun, and thought-provoking. And as always, we hope to see you again next week.
Yeah, maybe for the final time.
Spoilers.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the one alone